Well, hello and welcome to this Global Solutions Digital Summit interview. I'm Declan Curry. I'm a journalist and broadcaster. I'm in conversation with Peter Bakker and with Bob Moritz. Peter Bakker is the President and Chief Executive of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Bob Moritz is Chairman of PwC International. Gentlemen, thank you both for giving us your time for this conversation. Let's start with the topic that is dominating world affairs at the moment, and that is coronavirus. And the way that the response to the pandemic has accelerated and refocused attention on the purposes and agenda of this summit, the need for a greater connection between health and wealth, between society and business and economics. Bob Moritz, what are your thoughts?
I would agree with your point, Declan. The reality is the COVID-19 health crisis, societal crisis, and humanitarian crisis, and now economic crisis has accelerated every single one of those trends that you highlighted before. And it has increased the need and urgency for action. Action that has to be a combination of business, government, and communities working together. And that's why I think it's so important for us to have the dialogues today, because the needs going forward tomorrow are going to be bigger than ever before.
Peter Bakker, the challenge is this, that after the credit crunch, we had a lot of talk about how things need to change for the better, how capitalism needs to recalibrate itself. And in the end, you could argue very little happened. How do we make sure that action actually takes place this time?
Well, I'm not quite sure I buy your starting point. I think after the credit crunch, the financial system has really had some change. The resilience in the banking system has much improved. And that's what I really hope will happen now with the COVID-19 crisis. It has proven that the resilience of society, of our health system, of supply chains was ill prepared for a shock like this. And I'm actually quite sure now that the resilience of society as a whole, but certainly from a business point of view of supply chains, will completely be revisited, will include environmental and societal risks. And so I'm hoping we'll copy what happened in the banking sector, but now apply to the whole system. It's really systemic change that we need.
But Bob Moritz, when you're advising companies around the world and you speak to some of the leading business organizations on the face of the planet, and you say to them, it's time to build in resilience, it's time to rethink what we treasure and what we measure. When they turn around and say to you, actually, Bob, excuse me 1 second, my priority is just surviving to the end of the week. What's your argument there?
My argument is very clear. You have to do both. You have to survive to the end of the week and over the next few months and candidly for the next few years. So you have to repair the damage that's been done and the challenges that have been thrust upon everybody, but also at the same time, think about what you as an organization need to be coming out of this. And COVID-19 has just put that on steroids now. So we're advising organizations to say, step back and repair what's happened, rethink what you need to do, reconfigure your businesses. And as Peter said, think about it with broader societal expectations in mind, like supply chain, like carbon emissions, like people agendas, et cetera. Rethink and restart for a new tomorrow. And if those organizations that do that and do that quickly, they're the ones that are going to have the competitive advantages going forward and be able to contribute to society much more so and be recognized for it. Because there's another piece, which is actually reporting on that progress, which is equally as important to gather the trust of society in the organizations and the leaders these organizations have.
Peter, you talk about building resilience. Take us through some of the steps that business leaders and policymakers should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is map the vulnerabilities that have been exposed as part of this crisis. You know, whether it's your supply chain, your sales channels, whether it's some of the policies that policymakers put in place. Fundamentally, companies now need to integrate environmental and social risks much stronger into their governance. So there's great guidance. The COSO framework has guidelines on how to do that. But every board now has to take this in as part of their responsibility. It's no longer good enough to look at just the strengths of your balance sheet. You must have environmental and social risk equally included. And then you need to retune your strategies to see where are the opportunities where we can actually accelerate, like, Bob was saying, COVID will put all of this on steroids. And where do we have exposures that we just need to find solutions for? Because I can tell you one thing, the scientific evidence that COVID-19 has a strong link to the pressure we put on the environment, on nature, on deforestation, is telling me that shocks like this could and will happen again. Climate change will put shocks into us that unless we repair the weaknesses in our supply chains, they're going to give disruptions again. We need to get ready, but it's now becoming a governance element. And if every board in the world embraces that, if every board includes it in the communication to capital markets, then we'll make real fast step forward.
Bob Moritz.
The reality is, Peter's onto the right issues. We're looking for governments and businesses to work together here more so than ever before, along with the community leaders. But the business community has a huge opportunity here. First and foremost, that business organization and its leadership teams needs to recognize more so the demands of the broader stakeholder group. That group is now much more empowered and informed than ever before. Second is to make sure that they understand and articulating the purpose in terms of how they are satisfying or attempting to satisfy those stakeholders. Third, as Peter started to hint towards, they've got to put the incentives in place, the governance mechanisms and the oversight to make sure that the expectations are being articulated, understood, measured, and progress is being achieved, and therefore being rewarded for the holistic nature of that. And this is inclusive of shareholder responsibilities, but not exclusive of them. And the reality is stakeholder responsibility becomes paramount as the umbrella. And last but not least then is to put the mechanisms in to report on this. And that allows for governance bodies to actually provide that oversight, but also for the world to see progress and comparability of organizations. And what's really interesting, Declan, is right now I would have said the world has never been more primed for businesses to have competitive advantage when they're doing that. Why is that? Their employees, their consumers, their business partners, their banks, yes, their shareholders are activists now and are making decisions that implicate whether or not these organizations will be there. And you see that with many different examples that have happened. And as a result of COVID-19, this also will put a spotlight on what those organizations do, how they reward the behaviors, and hopefully the contributions that they make to society and the broader stakeholders in the areas that we're talking about today.
Peter, the challenge here for many organizations, as Bob outlines, is that the holy writ has been that their purpose is to reward shareholders, is to deliver shareholder value. Are we saying to companies now that that's simply not possible in the future, that the whole idea of just serving shareholders, of doing things in the most economically efficient way, is a false promise?
Well, I think Bob was totally right in his statement. I counted, he used the word stakeholders 5 times in his previous answer. And, I remember being in Davos this year in January, which is only 4 months ago, but it feels like 4 years ago, to be honest.
In the days when we could travel, yeah?
yeah, those days. But there, everybody was talking about stakeholder capitalism. And why was that? Because 2 months before that, in the US, the Business Roundtable had 182 CEOs signing that shareholder capitalism could no longer be the center of what we were trying to do. It was about stakeholder capitalism. But now let's be honest to ourselves. 7 weeks into the crisis, the US is up to 40 million unemployed people. Well, how stakeholder capitalist is that? So it's easy to say it's no longer shareholders, it's now stakeholders. But the test is always when the pressure goes up. And I think we really need to do it a step back system-wide. If we're serious about stakeholder capitalism, which we should be because of all the things we said, climate change, inequality, all the trends that are out there, we have to take an honest view on what does that mean when the crisis hits. How do we make sure that all these people get back into jobs, the livelihoods are being restored, that people have access to healthcare, that the healthcare systems are able to deal with these type of issues. So yeah, I totally agree. Stakeholder capitalism is the model going forward. I am very happy to see that a growing group of people are saying that, but I don't think we've worked out what it really means yet.
Bob Moritz.
Declan, the reality is when we look back at the last crisis we had, the financial crisis, there were many lessons that we were learning, but I don't think we've done enough to absorb them and apply them sufficiently. And I think this crisis is going to bring those kind of learnings to the forefront again. And just to be very specific on Peter's point here, the traditional measures of success, the definition of GDP growth, the definition of unemployment, the definition of stakeholder and shareholder returns are measures that I think go back to that shareholder perspective, not a stakeholder perspective. So that's why it's important for the whole system to think about what levers of change can we make here to move forward. And those kind of mechanisms and perhaps government reporting and broader reporting across the globe around what is truly a measure of success now is going to have to be different. And that's one of the lessons learned that clearly came out of 10 years ago. And I don't think we've absorbed that yet today. We're still using those traditional measures. So creating that incentive from all aspects, governments, governance bodies of organizations, NGOs and the like, all of us creating the awareness, continue to put the pressure on, and then allowing for the judges, that being society, to differentiate between those that are doing well in the broader stakeholder area versus those that are not. Those are the ones that are going to be making different decisions. They will not join a organization as an employee. They'll choose to go elsewhere. They will not choose to use their products and services. They will choose not to invest in that company. And that's why this is a broader societal change than just a business or a government change that's got to be driven.
And Peter, when we talk about how we encourage business and society at large to adopt and to implement the lessons that we will learn, Bob's reference to motivation is a critical one at a real practical level. That's how you encourage people to change behavior. Peter.
Absolutely. And I think that's another side of the COVID crisis that we haven't explored. You can talk about climate change as long as you like, but it remains a relatively abstract phenomenon. Unless it's your forest that burns down in the next forest fire, it's a faraway problem. What COVID has done, it has brought the crisis to every doorstep. There's nobody in the world. Look at us, we're all calling in from our home offices at the moment. Why? Because we're not allowed to go to our office. We can't travel to Berlin this year for the meeting. So this crisis makes it personal. And that's one of the biggest drivers of hope I have for why this time we will actually really change. Because it's clear that unless we get on top of these issues, with the global connectivity that we've now built in our economies, the next shock will come to our doors again and will affect our families again. And if that's not going to give us the motivation to change, then nothing will happen.
Well, Peter, you mentioned global connectivity in that answer, but when you look at the response to the coronavirus crisis, it has been a series of measures by national governments acting in what they see as their national interest. How do we get a response, a forward-looking response to this that can be delivered locally, effectively, but still looks towards that global sense of responsibility?
Yeah, I think geopolitically we're in an incredibly difficult, challenging period. It's true that also the global institutions that we have built over the years have proven ill-prepared for some of the shocks that COVID has released. It's certainly true that with all the politics flying around in different parts of the world, that it's not always easy to have a global answer to things. But I'm actually hopeful that business will be able to do a lot there, because business is such a strong force in the economy. We all talk about global supply chains. The majority of those are business supply chains. So if business can truly work through making these supply chains globally more resilient, globally have a more equitable treatment of people, globally ensure that where their operations are, there are healthcare systems that can support people even when there is something going on, then that will be an element, and I'm not saying business can do it alone, but an important element that hopefully over time will bring global conversations to better shape than they are today.
But Moritz, is business willing to accept that challenge, that responsibility to nurture global cooperation at a time of increasing domestic nationalism?
I think they are. I would go back to where Peter went. If you go back to January at the World Economic Forum, you very much saw from our various politicians around the world that element of nationalism and protectionism, and the walls had gone up quite a bit. But the issues, for example, like climate, before this crisis came upon us, the business community was the one that was stepping up and saying, no, regardless of what a government is saying, whether or not you're part of the Paris Accords or not, I'm willing to be carbon neutral by X date and figure out ways to reconfigure, rethink my supply chain in such a way that'll be beneficial for the world at large. So I do think they are up for the challenge. The concern that you have today is whether or not leadership of the businesses community is really able to step up to those challenges and sustain their efforts in that area, now with COVID-19 on top of it, now with an economic pressure on top of that. So how do you solve for the end question, which is, can I continue to manage for the long-term sustainability of the stakeholder expectations at a time where I've got a decreasing economic aspect that's going to be in front of me in a crisis in terms of how to best manage? You said it yourself, Declan. When this crisis first started, we were all aligned. It was take care of our people at all costs, the safety and protection of them. And then it became the issues of how many can I keep employed? And as Peter rightly said, with the number of employment out there now, how do you strike the right balance? This is a balance between these short-term issues and these longer-term objectives. It is a balance. And with hope here, and again, those that are participating in this digital summit, is will society at large, will humanity at large step up to the challenge of taking on climate or taking on COVID-19 or whatever those challenges are, rather than individual countries or individual businesses, because we've got to come together more so. And the system that has served us well is when the system has come together in various parts. We've never always aligned and agreed, but there's been enough cohesiveness that's allowed for that movement forward and that progress forward in such a way that society benefits from it. And I'm confident business is ready to do that. We've seen evidence of it, and they're continuing to do that today.
And Peter, leadership is essential here, because leadership is a succession of choices. It's the choice to view the recovery from this as in conflict with sustainability, or the choice of saying that we will embed sustainability within our stimulus and recovery measures. It comes down to the choices that leaders in business and in government will make. Peter.
I totally agree. I mean, in the world of sustainability, post-COVID, everybody's talking about building back better. That's now the words that we all memorize. But what better is and how you build back towards that, that's going to be determined by the leaders. I always say leadership is not following the recipe that somebody else has written. It's creating the recipe, it's finding the path to that better thing that we want to build. It's critical. In business, the businesses that I work with in the World Business Council, we see everybody say the same thing. Yes, we need to fix the short-term economic challenges that are out there, but we cannot let go. No, we need to amplify what we were doing in sustainability. It's going to be our competitive position going forward. It's going to be the only way for business to maintain its license to operate, and it's going to be the main contributor to building back better.
So there is an element of compulsion in there, Peter, when you're dealing with businesses that haven't signed up for sustainability, that haven't made what you would see as the right choices already.
Yeah, no, circling back to what I said earlier, given that COVID has made this crisis so personal for everybody, the challenge to your license to operate, if you're not sustainable, will be much bigger. You know, like Bob was saying, everybody is now the judge of what a company or a country or the local community does. And yeah, I think you need to get onto this agenda now, or you'll be left behind.
Bob Moritz, do you think we will really see genuine change? If we're talking about this in a decade's time, is it going to be the same conversation?
I think these challenges will always be there, but will we make progress? I think the answer is absolutely yes. The aha moment, particularly for the business community, I think came in three different forms. First is you did see many from around the world take this stakeholder view. Peter alluded to it earlier in terms of in the US, which has been a little bit slower than Europe when the Business Roundtable came out with its statement. That was an aha moment to recognize that. The second aha moment was the fact that they understand now that the competitive advantage to be in business and be successful in business is going to be determined by others. And those stakeholders have a larger point of view. Many of them now have to answer the question by their banks. Are you doing things in a way that's appropriate, relevant to the climate? We're seeing differentiation amongst the investor group. We're seeing the employees choose to be part of my organization or revolt by the decisions we're making. So they know it is now a competitive advantage to have these things top of mind. And last but not least is you've got competitive pressures. As organizations now are stepping up these challenges, many are saying, well, hold on, you're doing it. Why aren't you? And that competitive pressure is really coming to life right now. That's why the concepts that Peter and his organization are putting forward and others like the WEF in terms of let's get a mechanism to report and demonstrate progress and comparability, I think is another motivating factor for the CEOs to jump onto this. So yeah, I am confident we're going to make progress. Will we solve all the world's problems? No, not necessarily, but that's progress in general over the last few hundred years.
Well, thank you very much. You've been listening to Bob Moritz, who's the chairman of PwC International, and Peter Bakker, who's the president and chief executive of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm Declan Curry. Thank you for being part of the Global Solutions Summit.